Every empire eventually reaches a point, and after that moment the illusion begins to crack. The streets still feel alive, the flags still wave proudly above government buildings, the army still stands ready against its enemies, and the markets still appear full of life. But underneath the surface, the numbers begin telling a different story, because history reveals something brutal that most civilizations never want to admit. Great empires rarely collapse because they are conquered from the outside. Most of them collapse because they slowly become financially unsustainable from within. Rome, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, at their peaks, all of them looked unstoppable. And yet every one of them eventually encountered the same invisible enemy: debt. Not ordinary debt, civilizational debt. The kind of debt that slowly accumulates across generations, until maintaining the empire itself becomes impossible. And the most terrifying part is this: at first, the process usually looks harmless. In fact, it often begins during periods of extraordinary success. Rome once controlled nearly the entire Mediterranean world. Gold flowed into the empire from conquered territories. Trade expanded across continents. Massive roads connected even the most distant provinces. To Roman citizens, the empire looked eternal. But empires are expensive. Armies must be paid on time. Borders must always be defended. Infrastructure must constantly be maintained. And politicians must keep the population satisfied. And over time, Rome's financial appetite became impossible to sustain. At first, the empire solved this problem through endless conquest. New territories brought new wealth, new taxes, new slaves, and new resources. Expansion itself was financing the system, but eventually, Rome reached its natural limits. The empire could no longer grow fast enough to feed its own increasing complexity. And this is where the real problem began. Rome started devaluing its currency. Coins that once contained high amounts of silver were slowly mixed with cheaper metals. To ordinary citizen, the coins still looked Roman, but their real value was collapsing. And history repeated the same cycle humanity still struggles with today. As the value of money declined, prices exploded. Inflation spread rapidly across the empire. Trust began collapsing. Economic instability accelerated. But the empire kept spending anyway, because once populations become dependent on state systems, reducing comfort becomes politically dangerous. And this may be one of the most important lessons in history. Empires often continue pretending prosperity still exists, long after the financial foundations have already started collapsing. Even while Rome weakened internally, it increased spending. Military costs exploded. Corruption spread throughout the bureaucracy. And tax pressure intensified once again. And eventually, the system became too heavy to carry itself. By the time barbarian invasions intensified, Rome was already financially exhausted. The empire had not only become militarily weak, it had become economically fragile. Centuries later, the Ottoman Empire entered a disturbingly similar path. At its peak, the Turks controlled strategic trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Istanbul had become one of the richest cities on earth. The empire possessed enormous military and political power. But history shows something dangerous. Wealth often creates the illusion of permanence. As European powers industrialized, the global trade system began changing. The Ottomans struggled to modernize at the same pace. Military expenses increased. Administration became inefficient. Internal corruption deepened. And slowly, the empire became dependent on foreign debt. European creditors had now begun financing the survival of the Ottoman Empire itself. Think about how dangerous that is for an empire. The system could no longer generate enough internal strength to sustain itself naturally. It now required external financial life support. And debt always comes with a price. European influence over the Ottoman economy expanded, financial sovereignty weakened, political leverage shifted outward. By the 19th century, then the empire still looked massive geographically, but financially, it was already rotting from within. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire became trapped inside a cycle common to collapsing civilizations. More debt creates more fragility. More fragility creates more dependency. And more dependency creates even more debt. And once that cycle fully matures, collapse becomes only a matter of time. Then history repeated itself once again. The British Empire once ruled nearly a quarter of the planet. At its peak, London controlled global finance itself. The British pound became the backbone of international trade. British industry dominated global markets, and the empire possessed unmatched naval power. To much of the world, Britain looked invincible. But maintaining a global empire requires enormous spending. Wars are expensive. Navies are expensive. Global influence is expensive. And eventually, the financial burden became unbearable. World War I severely damaged British finances, and World War II accelerated the exhaustion even further. By the middle of the 20th century, Britain had technically won the war, but economically, the empire was losing its strength. Massive debt had accumulated. Maintaining global dominance became increasingly difficult, and America emerged as the new financial center of the world. And slowly, the British Empire entered decline, not because London had been invaded, not because British citizens suddenly became weak, but because the financial cost of maintaining the system became heavier than the empire could sustainably support. And this is what makes history so disturbing. Every empire believes its economy is different. Every empire believes modern technology or political systems make collapse impossible. But history keeps producing the same financial equation again and again. Expansion creates wealth. Wealth creates complexity. Complexity requires endless spending. And eventually, the system becomes addicted to debt. And this pattern is not limited to ancient empires. Modern civilizations operate through financial systems far more complex than anything Rome or the Ottomans could ever imagine. Governments borrow massive amounts of money. Central banks print currency at unprecedented scales. Entire economies become dependent on endless consumption and infinite growth. And as long as confidence remains high, the system appears stable. But confidence itself can become fragile, because debt behaves differently at the scale of civilizations. At first, debt accelerates growth. It creates prosperity, builds infrastructure, strengthens military power, and increases consumption. But eventually, future wealth begins getting consumed before it even exists. Civilizations begin spending tomorrow's resources to preserve today's comfort, and politically, this becomes extremely difficult to stop, because modern societies are addicted to stability and convenience. Reducing spending becomes unpopular, sacrifice becomes politically toxic, and short-term comfort begins overpowering long-term survival. And history shows how dangerous this can become, because empires do not collapse the moment debt appears. They collapse after pretending for years that the debt no longer matters. Rome continued devaluing its currency. The Ottomans continued borrowing. Britain continued maintaining global commitments. And for a very long time, the illusion still worked, and that is what makes collapse so deceptive. The lights still stay on. The stores remain open. People continue living normal lives. Normality itself becomes camouflage for instability, and eventually civilizations reach a point where maintaining the illusion requires increasingly extreme intervention, more debt, more money printing, more financial manipulation, until finally, the weakness underneath can no longer be hidden. History reveals another disturbing truth. Financial collapse is never purely economic. It becomes psychological. Trust erodes. People lose faith in institutions. Social unity weakens. Political extremism rises, because money itself is built on collective belief. And once societies begin losing confidence in the future, the entire system becomes fragile. This is why financial collapse often appears during the later stages of civilizations. Not because debt automatically destroys empires, but because excessive debt usually reflects something deeper. A civilization beginning to consume more than it is capable of sustainably producing. And perhaps this is the ultimate irony of empire. The success that creates prosperity also creates the temptation for endless expansion. More armies, more programs, more luxury, more promises. And eventually, the civilization becomes trapped maintaining a standard of living it can no longer naturally sustain. And history shows this is emotionally difficult for societies to accept, because people become psychologically attached to prosperity. They believe growth will continue forever. Markets assume expansion will never end. Governments assume future generations will somehow solve the problem later. Rome learned this. The Ottomans learned this. Britain learned this. And perhaps one day, the modern world may face the same realization. Because history does not merely study the past, it studies human nature. And human nature has changed very little across thousands of years. It studies human nature, and human nature has changed very little across thousands of years. Power still encourages excess, prosperity still creates complacency, and debt still creates fragility. Technology changes, but the pattern remains the same, and perhaps that is why every great empire eventually encounters the same terrifying realization. The system looked strongest, right before the cracks became impossible to ignore.